The moon hung low in the sky, casting a dim, eerie light over the desolate road that led to the old bridge. It had been years since anyone had dared to cross it at night, but the memories of that fateful accident were still fresh in the town's collective mind. The Willowbrook Bridge, once a beautiful structure, now a symbol of tragedy. Some said the bridge was cursed, others whispered that a vengeful spirit haunted its beams, waiting to claim those foolish enough to cross after dark. For Sarah Mitchell, this was nothing more than a story told around campfires, until tonight. She gripped the wheel of her car tightly, her knuckles pale. It was a chilly autumn evening, and Sarah was returning home after a long day at work. Her route had taken her past the bridge more times than she could count. But tonight was different. Tonight, something in the air felt heavy, oppressive, like the world itself was holding its breath. The old bridge loomed ahead, barely visible in the dark, its stone archways like silent sentinels guarding the entrance to an unknown abyss. The headlights of her car illuminated the weathered wooden planks, which groaned as if protesting her presence. Sarah's mind raced with the stories she'd heard about the bridge. The accident that had occurred there all those years ago. A young couple had lost their lives when their car plunged into the river below, its tires slipping on the slick road. It was said that their spirits never left, forever trapped between the world of the living and the dead, seeking revenge on anyone who dared cross the bridge at night. She had never believed in ghosts or curses, but tonight, there was an unmistakable sense of unease settling over her, a feeling that grew stronger the closer she got to the bridge. Forcing herself to focus, Sarah took a deep breath and pressed on the accelerator. Just drive through, she told herself. It's nothing, just a bridge. The tires of her car rumbled over the bridge's uneven surface, the sound reverberating through the silence. The moonlight glinted off the dark water below, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, waiting for her to make the wrong move. And then, as if on cue, her headlights flickered. What the hell? She thought, her heart racing. She reached for the dashboard, but before she could react, the lights blinked out completely, plunging her into darkness. Panic surged through her veins. She slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. She had already crossed the midpoint of the bridge. The car shuddered, its engine sputtering as if it was struggling to stay alive. The sound of the engine dying echoed through the night, a low, throaty groan that seemed to reverberate from the very bowels of the bridge. Sarah quickly twisted the key, but the engine refused to start. She pressed her foot harder on the gas pedal, but nothing happened. Her breathing quickened, and a cold sweat broke out on her forehead. The bridge had swallowed her car's power, leaving her stranded in the middle of nowhere. Her eyes darted nervously around her, scanning the darkened landscape for any sign of movement. But all she could see was the shadowy expanse of trees surrounding the bridge, their branches swaying in the wind like skeletal arms. Get out! Get out now, Sarah's mind screamed at her. She fumbled with the seatbelt, her fingers trembling, and managed to unbuckle it. She swung the door open, her breath coming in short gasps, but just as her foot touched the ground, a scream ripped through the silence. It was a blood-curdling, high-pitched wail, a cry that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. Sarah froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The scream echoed, bouncing off the stone walls of the bridge, and then silence. For a moment, Sarah couldn't move, couldn't think. The sound had frozen her in place, her body rigid with terror. She glanced nervously over her shoulder, her breath coming in ragged gasps. But there was nothing behind her, only the dark void of the night. Okay, calm down, she muttered to herself, taking a step back toward her car. It's just an animal, some kind of... The sound came again, but this time it was different. It wasn't just a scream, it was a voice, a voice that whispered her name. Sarah. Her blood ran cold. The voice was so close, so intimate, as if the spirit of the bridge was right beside her, calling her, pulling her into the darkness. She spun around, but still there was nothing. No one. Was I imagining it? She wondered, her mind racing. Am I losing my mind? But then, the air grew thick. The temperature dropped so quickly that Sarah could see her breath fogging in front of her. The shadows around her seemed to grow deeper, darker, and before she could react, she saw them. Figures, shapes, moving within the shadows, stretching and distorting like dark silhouettes. She couldn't make out their faces, but she could feel their eyes on her, cold, unblinking eyes. The whispers started again, this time louder, more insistent. Sarah. The figures shifted, and for a split second, Sarah swore she saw a woman in the shadows, her face pale, her eyes hollow, as if the life had been drained from her. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The woman's fingers twitched, reaching toward Sarah. Terrified, Sarah stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her chest. The woman's face twisted into a grotesque smile, her lips curling unnaturally as she reached for Sarah's throat. In a panic, Sarah turned and sprinted back to the car, her feet pounding against the bridge's wooden planks. She yanked at the door, desperate to escape, but it was locked. The handles wouldn't budge, and the car's interior lights flickered erratically, as if something was trying to break through. A cold breath brushed against her ear, and the voice came again, louder, more frantic. You shouldn't have crossed. Now you'll never leave. Sarah's pulse raced as she fumbled with the door, her hands slick with sweat. She could hear the rustling of the shadows closing in on her. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the world itself was closing in around her. Just as she was about to give up hope, the car door finally gave way, and she threw herself inside. The engine sputtered to life, and she slammed her foot on the accelerator. But as she sped away, the last thing she saw in the rearview mirror was the woman's face, twisted, broken, and grinning with malice. Sarah's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles were white. The tires screeched as she drove away from the bridge, her heart racing in her chest. The voice, the whispers, still echoed in her ears, lingering like a shadow she couldn't shake off. You shouldn't have crossed. Now you'll never leave. The words repeated in her mind, looping over and over, drowning out everything else. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. The shadows on the bridge, the woman's twisted face, the chilling whispers. They were too real to be just a product of her imagination. She glanced nervously in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the ghostly figure following her. But the road behind her was empty. The darkness stretched out into nothingness. No trace of the bridge, no sign of the figures. But the unease lingered, crawling beneath her skin. She couldn't ignore the feeling that something was still watching her. Her phone buzzed in the passenger seat, pulling her from her thoughts. She reached for it, her hands still shaking as she unlocked the screen. The message was from her friend, Emily. How's it going? Did you make it home okay? Sarah's fingers hovered over the keyboard. She wanted to tell Emily everything. The bridge, the whispers, the woman's face. But part of her feared that no one would believe her, that they would think she was losing her mind. Instead, she typed a simple reply. I'm fine, just a little shaken up. I'll call you tomorrow. She tossed the phone aside, trying to focus on the road ahead. The further she drove, the more her mind raced. What had happened on that bridge? As the minutes ticked by, the events replayed in her mind. The woman in the shadows, the voice, the cold breath on her neck. It was all too real. And yet, she couldn't make sense of it. Was it a ghost? A hallucination? Or something even worse? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden sound. A soft tapping, like fingers rapping on the car window. Sarah froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She turned her head, half expecting to see the twisted figure of the woman outside. But there was nothing, just the empty road and the darkness beyond. It's just the wind, Sarah told herself, trying to steady her breath. But the tapping persisted, louder now, growing in intensity. It was coming from behind her, from the back of the car. She glanced in the rearview mirror, her pulse quickening. Nothing, no one, just the empty seats and the dim glow of the dashboard lights. But then she saw it. In the reflection, something moved. Figure, a dark silhouette, standing just behind her. It was a woman, the same woman from the bridge. Her breath caught in her throat as the figure seemed to take a step forward, its face just out of view. Sarah's grip on the steering wheel tightened, her hands slick with sweat. No, 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 she thought, panic flooding her chest. It's just the shadows. It's not real. But deep down, she knew it wasn't just her mind playing tricks on her. The woman was real, and she was here. The tapping grew louder, frantic now, as if the woman was pressing her face against the window. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest. She could feel the coldness seep into the car, chilling her to the bone. Without thinking, Sarah slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt in the middle of the road. The tapping stopped abruptly, and for a moment, all she could hear was the pounding of her own heart. What do I do? What do I do? She wasn't sure how much longer she could take this. The fear was suffocating. Her hands trembled uncontrollably as she glanced at the rearview mirror again. This time, the woman was gone. But that didn't mean she was safe. Sarah quickly put the car in drive, her foot pressing hard on the accelerator. The tires screeched again as she sped down the road, her eyes darting nervously around her. She couldn't escape the feeling that she was being followed, that the woman was still out there, lurking in the darkness, waiting for the right moment to strike. As she drove, Sarah's mind raced. What was happening? Was the bridge really cursed? Was the woman's spirit somehow attached to it? And why was she haunting her? The answers seemed just out of reach, like fragments of a nightmare she couldn't quite remember. She glanced down at the dashboard, noticing that the temperature gauge had dropped significantly. The air in the car felt thick and oppressive, as if the shadows from the bridge had followed her into the vehicle itself. A sudden chill swept over her, and Sarah shivered, her breath fogging up the windshield. She wiped the glass with the back of her hand, only to see the outline of the woman's face, pale, gaunt, and twisted, pressed against the glass. A scream tore from Sarah's throat, but before she could react, the image vanished, leaving only the cold, empty space in front of her. No, 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 no. Her vision blurred as she fought to steady herself, her mind spinning. The car swerved slightly as her hands gripped the wheel too tightly. It felt like the world was closing in around her, and she had nowhere to turn. The air grew colder, and she could feel a presence beside her, breathing softly, as if waiting for the right moment to strike. And then she heard it, the voice, soft at first but growing louder, more insistent. Sarah? Her blood ran cold as she turned her head toward the voice. There, in the passenger seat, was the woman. Her hollow eyes stared back at Sarah, her lips curling into a grotesque smile. You shouldn't have left. You can't escape. The car jerked violently as Sarah slammed her foot on the brake. But when she looked up, the woman was gone. Or had she? The car was still moving, but the road had changed. The familiar streetlights were gone, replaced by an unnatural darkness. The world around her seemed to twist and distort, as if she were no longer in the real world at all. No, This isn't happening. This isn't real. But Sarah couldn't deny what was happening. The bridge had claimed her, and she wasn't sure if she would ever make it out. Sarah's heart raced as she pressed the pedal to the floor, the engine roaring as the car sped through the distorted road. The world around her seemed to shift, its familiar contours now warped, like she was driving through a nightmare. The moon hung low in the sky, its pale light casting long shadows that stretched unnaturally across the street. This isn't real. Can't be. She glanced nervously at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the woman's twisted face again. But the mirror was empty, reflecting nothing but the dark stretch of road behind her. Still, the fear gnawed at her insides, an inescapable presence that pressed down on her chest, suffocating her. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she fought to steady her trembling hands on the wheel. Every instinct screamed for her to stop the car, to get out and run as far away as possible. But something told her that if she did, the nightmare would only get worse. "You can't escape," the voice whispered in her mind. Not now. The car's headlights flickered, briefly casting the road ahead into darkness before they returned. Sarah's grip tightened on the wheel, her knuckles aching from the pressure. She had to focus. She had to find a way out of this. The road ahead seemed endless, stretching into a vast, empty abyss. There were no other cars, no streetlights, just the eerie stillness of the night. Sarah had no idea where she was anymore. The familiar landmarks had disappeared, swallowed up by the darkness. Suddenly, the headlights illuminated something ahead, something that made her blood run cold. The bridge. It was just as it had been before. The same twisted metal beams, the same ghostly fog curling around the edges. But this time there was something different. The air felt heavier, the night even darker, as if the very world had turned against her. The bridge looked ancient, as if it had been standing for centuries, waiting for her to return. "No, I can't go back there. I won't." But before she could turn the car around, something strange happened. The road ahead seemed to bend, pulling her toward the bridge. No matter how hard she turned the wheel, the car seemed to veer back toward the cursed structure. Her breath caught in her throat. It was as if the bridge was alive, pulling her in with an irresistible force, one she couldn't escape. "Get out! Get out! Get out!" Her heart pounded in her chest as she slammed her foot on the brake, the car screeching to a halt just before the entrance to the bridge. The engine sputtered and died, plunging her into an unnatural silence. Sarah's hands were shaking violently now, her entire body trembling as she tried to collect herself. She had to leave. She had to get away from the bridge. But as she reached for the door handle, a cold, sharp breeze rushed through the car, sending a chill down her spine. She froze. Something was outside the car. She could feel it. It's her. The woman from the bridge. The car windows, fogged up from her breath, began to clear on their own. As the condensation lifted, Sarah could see the reflection of the bridge in the glass. But it wasn't the same. The reflection showed the bridge as it had been in the past, old, rusted, and crumbling, a place forgotten by time. And standing at the far end, just barely visible in the shadows, was the woman. Her face was still twisted and grotesque, her hollow eyes glowing faintly. But there was something new, something that made Sarah's blood run cold. The woman was smiling, and she wasn't alone. Behind the woman, in the dark, stood a figure, tall and imposing, its features obscured by the darkness. Sarah couldn't make out its face, but she could feel its presence. It was wrong. It didn't belong in this world. No, no, no. Sarah's breath quickened as she tore her eyes away from the mirror, her heart pounding in her chest. The car jerked forward, as though something had pushed it, pulling Sarah out of her panicked state. She turned the key in the ignition, but the engine refused to start. Her pulse quickened as she tried again, desperately pressing the gas pedal. Nothing. The temperature inside the car dropped, the chill becoming unbearable. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, but it didn't help. The air felt thick, suffocating, like she was being smothered by something unseen. And then she heard it, a soft scratching sound coming from outside the car. It was faint at first, but it grew louder with each passing second, as if something was dragging its nails across the metal. No, 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 no. Sarah's heart raced as she looked out the window, her eyes scanning the darkness. The figure was getting closer. She could feel it. Get out, get out, get out. The voice echoed in her mind again, the words becoming louder, more insistent, until they drowned out all other sounds. Her hands shook uncontrollably as she fumbled with the door handle, desperate to escape. But before she could open the door, something moved in the rearview mirror. The woman's face was there, her hollow eyes staring straight at Sarah, her lips parting into a grin. "You shouldn't have left," she whispered, her voice cold and jagged, like the scraping of metal against stone. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't look away. The woman's eyes were locked on hers, and Sarah felt a wave of dizziness wash over her, like the world was spinning out of control. The air inside the car grew even colder, and Sarah shivered violently. Her hands were numb from the cold, her chest tightening as the fear threatened to overwhelm her. "You're trapped," the voice whispered again, closer this time, almost inside her head. And then, just as Sarah's vision blurred and she felt herself losing consciousness, the car engine roared to life. The headlights flickered back on, the engine humming steadily beneath her. The fog outside had lifted, the bridge was gone, and the road stretched ahead, clear and unbroken. But Sarah didn't feel relieved. She didn't feel safe. The woman's voice still echoed in her mind. "You can never leave. Not now." And somewhere in the distance, the sound of footsteps echoed, as if someone or something was following her. Sarah's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The engine hummed steadily beneath her, but the eerie feeling clung to her like a cold sweat. She was driving, but her mind was elsewhere, haunted by the memories of what she had seen. The woman's twisted smile, the shadowed figure lurking behind her, and the chilling voice that seemed to echo inside her head. She glanced into the rearview mirror once again, half expecting to see those same hollow eyes staring back at her. But the mirror was empty. Only the dark road stretched behind her. Just a hallucination, Sarah thought. It was just the stress, the fear, but deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. The air felt wrong, thick with an unnatural heaviness, and the road ahead seemed to stretch forever. No matter how far she drove, it felt like the world was folding in on itself, like she wasn't truly moving at all. The glow of her headlights was dim, casting weak beams of light against the endless blackness. There were no streetlights, no houses, nothing, just the eerie emptiness of the road. Her car felt like a tiny speck of light in a vast, consuming darkness. Her foot hesitated over the gas pedal. Should she stop? Should she turn around and go back? But she knew that she couldn't. The road felt like a trap, pulling her deeper into the unknown, and the bridge, the cursed bridge, was waiting for her. No matter how far she drove, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was heading straight toward it. Suddenly, the temperature inside the car dropped, and Sarah's breath fogged up in front of her. The chill crept over her skin, crawling down her spine, but she couldn't stop the car. The wheel seemed to move on its own, steering her towards something she couldn't understand. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. A shadow. It flickered in the periphery, like a fleeting glimpse of something that didn't belong. She whipped her head around, but there was nothing there. The empty road stretched on, the headlights illuminating the dark pavement ahead. But the feeling remained. Presence. It's following me, Sarah thought, her heart racing. It's not just in my mind. It's real. She pressed the gas pedal harder, the car speeding up, but the road seemed to curve ahead, narrowing. She didn't know how much time had passed, but the fog was thickening, wrapping around the car like an impenetrable shroud. The headlights barely cut through it now. Her hands trembled on the wheel. She couldn't outrun it. No matter how fast she drove, the fear, the presence. It was always there, just out of reach but too close to ignore. The road curved sharply, and Sarah's heart leapt into her throat as she realized where she was. The bridge. It appeared out of the mist, its rusted beams and crumbling structure looming like a dark sentinel in the night. Her breath caught in her throat. She had seen it once, and now it was back, even more terrifying than before. There was no choice. She had to cross it. Her body moved on its own, turning the wheel to guide the car toward the looming structure, as if some invisible force was pushing her forward. She could hear the thrum of her heartbeat in her ears, the pulse of her own blood pounding like an urgent warning. Her mouth was dry, and her skin was prickling with cold. Just get across it, she told herself. Just get across and then you can go home. This will be over. The car's headlights illuminated the first few meters of the bridge, casting strange shadows across the metal. The fog had thickened again, and now the bridge felt even more oppressive, like the darkness itself was alive, breathing in the spaces between the beams. Sarah gripped the wheel so hard that her fingers ached. Her eyes darted from the road ahead to the rearview mirror, watching for any signs of movement. That's when she saw it. In the reflection of the mirror, something moved. The woman. Her face appeared for the briefest moment, just as twisted and grotesque as before, her hollow eyes staring straight into Sarah's soul. But it wasn't just her. Behind the woman in the dark was something else. A figure, tall, looming, its features hidden in shadow. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, her body frozen in terror. Her foot slammed on the brakes, and the car screeched to a halt in the middle of the bridge. The fog swirled around her, thickening, until it seemed as though she was trapped in a world of mist and shadows. The headlights flickered, the eerie quiet of the night pressing in on her from all sides. Why won't it stop? Suddenly, a noise, a soft scratching sound, coming from the other side of the bridge. The sound of nails scraping against metal, growing louder and louder. Sarah's eyes snapped to the rearview mirror, her heart racing in her chest. The figure was moving closer. She could hear its steps, slow, deliberate, like something stalking its prey. A cold, malevolent presence pressed in from all sides. She couldn't move, couldn't speak, trapped in the silence that pressed against her chest. And then the voice came again, soft like a whisper but so close. You're too late. You've come back. The words sent a chill running down Sarah's spine, and she felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The woman's twisted smile flashed in her mind again, and this time, Sarah wasn't sure if she was hearing the voice or feeling it in her very bones. The sensation of being watched was overwhelming. The figure in the dark was getting closer, its presence suffocating her. With a sudden burst of panic, Sarah jerked the wheel, her foot slamming on the gas. The car lurched forward, hurtling down the bridge as the figure moved closer, the scratching sound now deafening in her ears. Get away, get away, get away. But as she looked ahead, her breath caught. The road had disappeared. There was nothing but darkness, stretching out before her like an endless void. She was trapped. The fog was thicker than ever now, suffocating, swallowing everything. The car headlights flickered one last time before dying, leaving her in absolute darkness. And that's when she heard it, a soft whisper, "You're not alone." Sarah's breath came in sharp gasps as the car coasted through the heavy fog. The silence around her was deafening. The engine's hum, the only sound breaking the stillness. Her hands trembled on the wheel, her heart pounding in her chest. She had stopped in the middle of the cursed bridge, and she had no idea what was happening around her. The voice still echoed in her mind, that soft whisper, "You're not alone." She looked into the rearview mirror again. Her eyes flicked from the glass, half expecting to see the figure, the woman, standing behind her once more. The air was thick, and the weight of it pressed down on her like a suffocating hand. Every breath she took felt like a struggle, each one pulling her deeper into the darkness. The headlights of the car flickered one final time before plunging her into total blackness. How did it get so dark? She thought, her hands instinctively reaching for the ignition. But the key didn't turn. She tried again, the panic rising in her throat. Nothing. Her eyes darted to the side. The fog was closing in. Thick, swirling masses of white and gray rolled over the bridge, drowning out the world. The car sat motionless, a tiny island in the middle of an endless void. What's happening? Sarah's mind raced, searching for answers, but her thoughts kept slipping away like water through her fingers. The air felt heavier now, as if something unseen was weighing her down. The temperature had dropped drastically, turning the air around her to ice. Suddenly, she heard it again, a scratching sound. Soft at first, but it grew louder, scraping against the car like nails dragging over metal. Her body went rigid as the sound continued, the noise moving along the side of the vehicle, growing closer, until it seemed as though it was right beside her. She turned her head to the side, staring into the mist. Nothing. The scratching stopped. Her pulse raced in the silence. She wanted to scream, to break free from the terrifying hold the bridge had on her. But she was frozen, her entire body paralyzed with fear. She didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. The air in the car felt thick, like the very walls were closing in on her. Is it real? Is it all in my mind? She shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts. There had to be a logical explanation for this, for the strange happenings, for the voice, for the shadows and the figure. But in her gut, she knew there was something out there, and it wasn't human. The car jerked forward suddenly, as if something had grabbed it. The force threw Sarah back into her seat. She gasped, her hands clutching the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She slammed her foot on the gas, the car roaring to life as the headlights flickered back on, cutting through the dense fog. But the road was no longer just a road. It was changing. The bridge, once solid, once familiar, seemed to warp and twist before her eyes. The metal beams stretched and contracted, bending unnaturally. The structure groaned under some invisible weight, the sound of metal scraping against metal reverberating through the air. Sarah could hear it, the screeching sound of something pulling at the very fabric of reality, tearing it apart. The world outside the car windows seemed to shift, as if the fog wasn't just a product of the weather, but something much more sinister. The shadows seemed to move, undulating like living things, reaching out toward the car with long, thin fingers. It's not just the bridge, she realized, her voice barely a whisper. The whole place is alive. A cold chill ran down her spine as she looked back to the rearview mirror. The figure was there. It wasn't just in her mind. There, standing in the fog behind her, was the shadow. Its outline was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs long and contorted. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The figure was shifting, moving closer. She slammed her foot down on the gas pedal, but the car refused to accelerate. It sputtered, jerking forward and then stalling, as if something was holding it back. The engine gave one last sputter before it died, leaving her in the suffocating silence. The figure was almost upon her. Sarah's breath hitched, her chest tightening in fear as the shadow loomed larger in the mirror. Her eyes widened, locking onto the figure's hollow, empty face. It had no features, just a mass of blackness where its eyes should have been. It was the face of something ancient, something terrifying, something that didn't belong in this world. The figure raised its hand, long fingers reaching toward the car. Get out now. A voice screamed inside Sarah's mind, but her body wouldn't move. She was paralyzed, trapped in the car, unable to escape. The temperature inside the car plummeted again, the air turning to ice. Her breath clouded in front of her as the darkness grew, thick and oppressive. She could feel the pressure of it, suffocating, closing in on her. And then the figure moved. Slowly, it reached out and placed its hand against the window. Sarah's heart stopped. The glass was cold to the touch, vibrating with an eerie energy. She could hear a soft scraping sound as the figure's fingers dragged across the glass, its touch leaving behind an unnatural coldness. The voice came again, but this time it wasn't just a whisper. It was a growl, deep and guttural, vibrating in her very bones. You shouldn't have come here. The words were like a curse, and as they echoed through the car, the world outside seemed to warp and twist. The figure's hand slid down the glass, leaving streaks of cold that seemed to burn into the surface. Sarah's mind raced. What is this? What does it want? The figure's face twisted, the shadows moving like liquid around its features, and for the first time, Sarah saw something. A flicker of recognition in its dark, hollow eyes. The figure knew her. It had been waiting for her. Without warning, the car lunged forward, the headlights cutting through the fog as the engine roared back to life. The figure vanished into the mist, but Sarah could still feel its presence, like a weight on her chest, suffocating her. She was driving now, the wheels screeching as she sped down the bridge, her mind a whirl of panic and fear. The bridge seemed endless, stretching on forever. She could see the dark shape of the figure in her rearview mirror, growing closer with each passing second. She was running out of time. The car roared down the bridge, the tires screeching against the wet road, as Sarah's mind raced. Her heart was pounding so loudly in her chest that she could hardly hear the sound of the engine over the thudding in her ears. She couldn't stop herself now. Every instinct screamed at her to keep driving, to outrun whatever was chasing her, whatever had been waiting for her on that cursed bridge. But it was no use. The fog had thickened, curling around the car like a serpent, and she could barely see more than a few feet ahead of her. The bridge, which had once seemed like just another stretch of road, now felt like a nightmare, a place where reality and darkness bled together. The figure she had seen earlier was still in her rearview mirror, its shadow growing larger, moving closer. It's not just following me, she realized with horror. It's coming for me. Her breath caught in her throat as she slammed her foot down harder on the gas pedal, urging the car to go faster. The headlights flickered again, casting weak beams of light into the fog, but it was no use. The mist seemed to swallow up the light, consuming everything in its path. How long is this bridge? She thought desperately, her eyes darting to the sides, searching for any sign of an end. But there was nothing. The road stretched on, an endless loop of fog and darkness, with no sign of escape. She could feel it now, the weight of the air pressing against her chest, suffocating her. The car seemed to be slowing down no matter how much she pressed the gas. It was as if something was holding her back, dragging her down into the depths of the fog. No, she thought, I can't stop. I can't let it get me. But then, the headlights flickered once more, This time, they didn't come back on. The car lurched, the engine sputtering and dying. Sarah slammed the steering wheel in frustration. "Come on!" she screamed, but the car refused to start again. The engine turned over, but it wasn't enough. The cold air inside the car seemed to freeze her in place. She was trapped. There was no sound except for the soft creaking of the bridge beneath her, as though the entire structure was groaning, weary from its age. The fog pressed against the windows, thick and suffocating, like it was closing in, trapping her inside. Sarah's eyes darted to the rearview mirror once again, and there it was. The figure was closer now, standing just beyond the reach of the headlights. The shadows swirled around it, distorting its form, but she could make out the faint outline of its long, thin limbs reaching out toward her. Its face, if you could call it a face, was still nothing more than a hollow mass of darkness. "It knows me," she thought, her body frozen in terror. "It's been waiting for me." Sarah's fingers trembled as she gripped the door handle, but before she could make a move, a soft sound reached her ears. It was barely a whisper at first, but it grew louder, more distinct. "You shouldn't have come." The voice was the same one from before, soft, almost soothing, but laced with a dark undertone. It seemed to come from everywhere, surrounding her. It was inside the car now, vibrating through the very walls. The air turned colder, and the fog outside thickened, swallowing the car whole. "It's too late to turn back," Sarah realized with a sickening feeling. "I can't escape." The shadow in the rearview mirror was no longer just a figure. It had begun to move, sliding across the surface of the glass, inching closer and closer, as though it were reaching through the mirror, trying to grab her. Sarah's pulse raced, her mind whirling. She reached for the door, her hands clammy and shaking. The sound of the shadow scraping against the window filled her ears, sending waves of panic through her chest. She could feel the presence of something ancient, something evil, pressing in on her. "What does it want from me?" Without thinking, she threw open the door and stumbled out onto the bridge. The cold air hit her immediately, but it was a relief compared to the suffocating atmosphere in the car. Her eyes were locked on the shadow in the rearview mirror, but as she looked back, it was gone. "What is happening?" she thought, panic rising in her throat. Where did it go? But before she could even move, the sound of footsteps echoed from behind her. It was the faintest sound at first, like someone walking slowly in the fog. She turned, her heart hammering in her chest. The shadow, no longer confined to the mirror, was walking toward her now, its form twisting and shifting in the mist. It was real. It was coming for her. "Get away from me!" Sarah screamed, but the words felt hollow in the dense air. They were swallowed up by the fog, disappearing into the emptiness. The figure was right behind her now, just a few feet away. She could hear its breath, or was it just the wind? She couldn't tell anymore. The temperature dropped even further, and the bridge seemed to groan louder with each passing second. Sarah stumbled back, her eyes darting around desperately. There was nowhere to go. The bridge stretched out endlessly in front of her, and behind her, the shadow was closing in, its hands reaching out with unnatural speed. Suddenly, she felt it, a cold, icy touch on her shoulder. Her skin crawled, and the world around her went still. The shadow's hand was on her, and as it gripped her, she felt herself being pulled toward the darkness. No escape. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as the shadow's cold grip tightened on her shoulder. She could feel the weight of the air pressing in around her, suffocating her. The bridge creaked beneath her feet, the sound mingling with the rhythmic beat of her pulse. She turned her head, desperately trying to pull away from the figure, but its hand didn't budge. It was cold, colder than anything she had ever felt before, and its touch seemed to seep through her skin, deep into her bones. What is this thing? She thought, her breath coming in sharp, frantic gasps. What does it want from me? The shadow's face, if you could call it that, was just a mass of darkness. There were no eyes, no features, only an empty void that seemed to absorb all light. It leaned closer to her, its presence suffocating, its grip unyielding. A voice whispered from within the fog. It was the same voice Sarah had heard before, the one that had sent chills crawling up her spine. You shouldn't have come here. The words wrapped around her like chains, tightening with each syllable. The air grew colder still, the mist swirling violently around her, blurring her vision. She tried to scream, but the words caught in her throat, stifled by the heavy, oppressive silence that hung in the air. Why couldn't she move? It was as if the very ground beneath her feet was frozen, holding her in place. The shadow's grip didn't loosen, but it shifted slightly, as if adjusting its hold. The fog parted momentarily, and Sarah's eyes locked onto something. Something in the distance, just beyond the bridge. A faint, flickering light danced in the mist, as though beckoning her to follow. She felt an overwhelming urge to run toward it. Without thinking, she wrenched herself from the shadow's grasp and sprinted toward the light. Her feet pounded the cold concrete, her breath coming in ragged bursts, but every step felt heavier than the last. The light grew brighter, but the fog seemed to close in around it, narrowing her path. Still, she ran, hoping that whatever the light was, it might be her salvation. As she drew closer, she saw something that made her blood run cold. There, standing in the center of the mist, was the outline of a figure. It was a man, but his face was obscured by the shadowy fog, his form a dark silhouette. The light came from an old, flickering lantern in his hand. Who is that? Sarah thought, panic bubbling up in her chest. What's happening? The man didn't move. He simply stood there, as if waiting for her. The fog seemed to thicken, swirling around her legs, trying to pull her back. Her instincts screamed at her to turn around and run in the opposite direction, but something kept her feet rooted to the ground. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the words wouldn't come. As if sensing her hesitation, the man raised the lantern. The light flickered once more, casting eerie shadows that danced across the bridge. He took a step forward, and with it, the temperature around Sarah dropped even further. The air became thick, as if the very atmosphere was charged with something unnatural. You shouldn't be here, the man's voice said, low and haunting. It was a whisper, but it felt like a command. Sarah's body tensed, the fear threatening to overtake her. I need to get out of here, she thought desperately. But as she turned, her eyes fell on the shadow, the thing that had been chasing her. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. The figure had taken shape, its dark form towering over her, its twisted limbs contorting unnaturally as it reached out toward her. Its hollow eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and its mouth opened, revealing rows of sharp teeth. It's real, Sarah thought, her heart racing. It's real, and it's coming for me. But then, just as the shadow lunged toward her, the man with the lantern stepped between them, blocking its path. Leave her alone. His voice was more forceful now, a deep growl that resonated in Sarah's chest. The shadow halted, but its form writhed, the air around it crackling with malevolent energy. The man stood firm, his lantern casting a soft, flickering glow between them. You don't belong here, the man said again, his voice steady and calm. This place, it's not for the living. Sarah's mind was spinning. She had no idea what was happening, but one thing was clear. The man with the lantern knew something about the curse, about the shadow, about the bridge. She needed answers. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Her throat felt dry, like she hadn't spoken in years. The man didn't answer at first. Instead, he reached into the fog with his free hand and gestured for her to follow him. "You need to get away from here," he said, "before it's too late." Before Sarah could respond, the shadow lunged again, its jaws snapping shut just inches from her face. The man stepped forward, swinging the lantern with a practiced motion, and the shadow recoiled. It screeched, a sound that made Sarah's blood run cold. The man didn't hesitate. "Come with me," he said urgently, grabbing her arm and pulling her away from the chaos. Sarah had no choice but to follow. The man led her through the mist, his lantern casting a narrow path ahead. The bridge seemed endless, the fog closing in around them, but she couldn't stop herself. The man was her only hope now, and if she stayed behind, she knew the shadow would claim her. Where is he taking me? She wondered, but the question was lost as the fog seemed to grow thicker, swallowing them whole. The fog seemed to stretch on endlessly, thick and suffocating, wrapping around Sarah like a heavy blanket. The man with the lantern moved swiftly, his footsteps sure and steady, as if he had walked this cursed bridge 1,000 times before. Sarah struggled to keep up, the chill of the air seeping deeper into her bones with each passing moment. Every time she looked behind her, the shadow was there, lurking just out of sight, always just out of reach, but never leaving her. Her heart pounded in her chest, the sound of it deafening in her ears. The man didn't speak again, but his grip on her arm tightened, urging her forward. She had no choice but to follow, though every fiber of her being screamed to turn and run. She didn't know where they were going or how long it would take to escape, but she trusted him. At least, she trusted that he might be her only chance at survival. The fog thinned, and the faintest trace of moonlight broke through the mist, casting an eerie glow over the bridge. Sarah squinted, trying to make out the shapes ahead. What she saw made her blood run cold. In the distance, a figure stood, motionless, at the far end of the bridge. It was the same silhouette she had seen earlier, the one holding the lantern. But now, there was something different about him. He stood tall and still, his form outlined against the faint moonlight. The shadow seemed to writhe and twist at his feet, crawling toward him like a creature hungry for vengeance. The man with the lantern stopped abruptly, pulling Sarah to a halt beside him. He turned to face her, his expression grave. "This is where it ends," he said, his voice low but resolute. "The curse cannot be broken, not fully. But you can leave. You must leave now." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Leave? She couldn't leave. She needed to know what had happened here, needed to understand why the bridge was cursed, why the shadow haunted her, why she was caught in this nightmare. "What's going on?" she whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them. The man's eyes softened, but the sadness in them was overwhelming. "This place is tied to death. The spirit of the bridge is vengeful. It was the scene of a terrible accident long ago. A woman died here, her life torn away in an instant. The spirit seeks revenge against those who cross after dark, pulling them into the past, into the horrors of that night." Sarah shivered. She had felt it, the oppressive weight of the curse, the eerie pull that had lured her onto the bridge in the first place. But it was more than that. She could feel something stirring beneath her skin, the whispers of a past that wasn't hers, yet somehow felt familiar. "What happened to her?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. She wasn't sure if she wanted to know the answer, but she had to ask. The man's gaze hardened, and he took a step back. "She died here, but her spirit, it's never truly left. It lingers, trapped in the place of her death, seeking to claim the souls of those who crossed the bridge. You were drawn here by the curse. But you don't have to stay. You can leave and the shadow won't follow you. The bridge will be quiet again. For you. For a moment, Sarah stood there, torn between the man's words and the haunting visions that still danced in her mind. The bridge seemed to grow darker with each passing second, the fog closing in again, thick and suffocating. Then, as if on cue, the shadow surged forward, its twisted form lunging toward them. It moved faster than she could have imagined, its hunger palpable, the air crackling with a malevolent energy that sent her heart racing. "Go!" the man shouted, pushing Sarah toward the end of the bridge. "Run! You can make it! Don't look back!" Without thinking, Sarah obeyed. She turned and ran, her feet pounding against the cold stone of the bridge. The wind howled around her, pushing her forward, urging her to flee. Her breath came in sharp, ragged gasps as the shadow's whispers filled her ears, promising terror, promising death. But she refused to listen. She couldn't look back. As the end of the bridge drew nearer, she saw the faint glow of the lantern, but the man was gone. The shadow was still behind her, its pursuit relentless, but she didn't dare slow down. The mist swirled, thickening again, but she could see the light ahead, the safety of the end of the bridge. She reached it just as the shadow reached for her, its cold hand brushing against her back. But Sarah leaped forward, her foot hitting the solid ground just as the shadow's fingers grazed her. She stumbled, catching herself on the stone, and turned to find that the shadow had stopped. It hovered at the edge of the bridge, seething with rage, but it couldn't cross. Sarah didn't stop to think. She ran, her legs burning, her heart hammering in her chest. She didn't know how far she had to go to escape, but she knew that she couldn't look back. When she finally reached the other side of the bridge, she stopped. The fog was lifting, the mist beginning to thin. The oppressive weight on her shoulders eased, and the shadow's presence faded, though she could still feel it lingering, waiting. And then, in the distance, she heard the sound of a car approaching, headlights cutting through the dark. She blinked, her vision blurry from the terror and the fog, but she could make out the silhouette of a vehicle. Sarah didn't wait. She ran toward it, calling out for help. As the car came to a stop, the figure in the driver's seat rolled down the window. But when Sarah looked inside, her blood ran cold. It wasn't a stranger. It was the man with the lantern. His eyes were empty, and his face was blank. And the lantern in his hand was no longer glowing.